All right, welcome everybody
Hello.
to this episode of Inclusive Agile Presents. I am Darren Peck. I'm the Director of Research at Inclusive Agile. Tell you a little bit about Inclusive Agile real quick. Um, at Inclusive Agile, we specialize in Agile consulting, but we take a different approach. We integrate inclusion and diversity right into the framework, because we see inclusion as not being just an HR problem, but it's like a solution for the whole organization for better practices and processes. So if you are in need of any professional consulting, please contact us. You can find us at inclusiveagile.io, or you can reach out to any of us, me or Dee directly, and or anybody else on our team. And Dee, would you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you. I will make sure it's really, really quick. I'm Dee. I'm the VP of Inclusion here at Inclusive Agile. I am non binary. I use they, them pronouns, but it's really easy to just call me Dee. Uh, this isn't about me, so I'm really excited to turn it over to Kimberly and allow you to introduce yourself. Kimberly?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Kimberly Reyes, and I am the founder of All the Unexpected. And I guess to tell you a little bit about us, we began as a podcast. My daughter was born about 26 weeks, which is 3.5 months early, and she spent 109 days in the NICU. And that was she was literally born the day that New York locked down. And so it was a confluence of a series of events that sort of led to me, after we were out of the thick of it, to say, you know what, we kind of need to tell this story. And so it began as a podcast, and like most things, sort of grew organically from then. And it turned into a website. And I said, okay, I need to maybe have some articles. And then I said, children grow and people have different needs. And so we started doing healthy living recipes, and we had articles about ways to detoxify the home, and just sort of all these things that kind of grew out of families taking care of themselves. But the genesis of the whole thing was, what happens when parenthood brings you the unexpected, right? And so we all know what to expect looks like, right? There's a formula and there's books, and they'll tell you all these things, but what happens when it's a bit off script, right? And so it's become a resource for families. And in an expansion of that, in January of this year, we began launching our documentary series. And the documentaries were looking specifically at the intersection of race and medicine, and how history has led to some of the disparities that we see today. And so, a bit about me: I'm actually a historian and a political scientist by training. And so I tend to sort of think of most things in that lens. And as I kind of was looking at motherhood, I said, well, a lot of this has to do with what's happened and how we've gotten here. And so that's kind of the broad strokes view of what we do.
That's really incredible. And I want to dive into so much of all of those things and hear stories. Um, but uh, I'm actually going to just turn it over and say, just tell me one of the best things recently. One of the families, a story that you feel like you can share. Obviously, don't share anything that you can't. But if you're open to sharing, what's someone you just recently impacted?
Oh, in terms of people that were okay. I was like, my
Yeah.
family, we have lots of stories. Okay. Well, it's funny. I get feedback from people all of the time, and I was talking to someone on LinkedIn actually yesterday, and we were talking about simple solutions of emotional de-escalation, right? And we were saying, one of the things that a lot of people sort of misinterpret about gentle and conscious parenting is that it's just about letting your kid do whatever they want to do. And it's like, no, it's really about self emotional regulation, right? And so someone was talking about their husband had decided to help and put everybody's clothes in the same washer together, and there was a major disaster, and they had to de-escalate. And I said, very similarly to dealing with your parent, your child as a parent, and your partner as someone who you know is co-parenting with you, right? You have to sort of take a step back and find simple solutions. And so I said, our house, everybody has their own laundry bag. And so you're kind of like responsible for your own thing. If you ask someone else to do it, you're doing so at your own risk. And we it works. No one's going to to have a grudge. And the woman said to me, that's such a beautifully simple solution. And I never would have thought of it, in a million years. And I said, yeah, that's part of kind of my whole thing with parenting. And maybe I spent 15 years as a teacher before my kid was born, including teaching preschool. So I tend to think of things as very solution oriented because I'm used to dealing with 25 kids. And so you have to sort of find the solution before the problem, becomes apparent. But, it was one of those things where simple dialogues, and I spend a lot of the day, especially on social media, just kind of posting things and someone comments and we have questions. And it's this very organic interaction between people, but it's really saying, how in our everyday lives can we apply some of these very broad stroke principles.
So I had a NICU baby, so I understand that aspect of it, and but I also was I had different experience than I'm sure you did in the NICU. I want to know, like, what was challenging about the NICU for you? What makes it different being a person of color? Like, what makes that a different? What hurdles do you have to face that I probably am unaware of?
Well, I think one of the things that we actually sort of talk about in both of the documentaries is this idea of the sort of bias that a lot of providers and, all kinds of staff who work in medicine carry around with them. And much of it really goes unnoticed because so much of it's actually built into the training of Western medicine, right? So, it's deeper than than deep in that sense. And so,
Mhm.
I it's funny because my husband and I often talk about remembering viscerally the entire experience, but then sometimes you forget these really insane moments, right? And so I remember so when my daughter was first born, I had still come out of surgery and my husband was obviously more mobile, having, not had major abdominal surgery. And he was at the time sporting this, giant beard, and you'll ask him different reasons why. And so, the 6 foot tall bearded guy, like running around the NICU like a crazy person, was very well known. Like everybody, even weeks later, people would say to me, oh wow, I finally met you. We know your husband really well. Like he's always here. So the whole idea of him being really well known around the unit was, a normal thing to me. And I remember there was a newer nurse because people would sort of float in and out of rotation. And I don't know what the conversation led to, but she looked at me and she goes, well, do you even have a husband? And sort of the level of bias and presumption about single Black motherhood and lack of support and all of these things. And I said, well, yeah, but your COVID protocols bans him from being here at the same time as me. So, besides that, but this moment of just sort of things that I know would have never gotten said to another mother. And there were a lot of things along the way because I was hospitalized for about 3 weeks before my daughter was even born that were just really, very blatant incidences, very sort of subtle things and different back and forth, and so it was a moment of just having to navigate another level of things. It's hard enough. Like, I tell anybody, if you've spent 1 hour in the NICU, like somebody should evaluate for PTSD, right? Because it is what it is, let alone 109 days, let alone, by ourselves because parents were banned from being together at the time, let alone, having presumptions about, all of the different things that were going on. So yeah, I think it adds another level. And if you begin to talk about the impact of long-term stress, and they're doing really fascinating studies about literally how it affects the sort of aging process of your telomeres, the things that keep you young, right? And so when you talk about the idea of stress weathering the body, literally, one has to think about what does it do, to a parent who's already stressed, already under pressure, and then has another layer of simply having to defend themselves, right? And so it's a really sort of very nuanced and complicated thing to address, for sure.
Thank you, first of all, for sharing that story and talking about some of those experiences. We don't want to, put you in a position where you have to, re-traumatize yourself as well. So anything that we ask, you can always say, I think I'll skip that too. But you said something that was magical to me, right? Those little simple solutions. And I would love to jump back to those if that's all right. And you're fine. Take a second.
I'm handing crackers to a tiny human, so she stays quiet.
Crackers, what I'm missing? Because right now it's a lot of we play, my partner and I, we play zone defense, right? So we can just never have meetings at the same time. We just kind of organize. Anyway,
crackers and Snoopy in space. It's like a winning combo. I've got a 3-year-old who's absolutely okay. Yeah, so it's an Apple show where somebody decided to turn Snoopy into an astronaut, and I've got a kid who's like obsessed with the planets. So she's like, it's the Mars Grover, which she calls it, not Rover. And so yeah, it's a whole
Mars Grover. Oh my gosh, there are so many different comics that are going through my head right now.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It's really fun if you want to do some play with Midjourney like I have. You can make a Mars Grover, and the images were fantastic. Like we used some AI art to give her Cookie Monster in space, and there was like a fire truck with the solar system, and it's actually been really fun to play with the AI. If you let a 3-year-old give you AI art prompts, like the results are fantastic.
That sounds like something we should actually kind of collect and then do like a whole show, like a whole art show on kids meets AI art.
I think so, but yeah,
that would be amazing.
Okay, back to your question because we were both digressing.
Let's go back to that. That's really, really fun. So I wanted to hit on this because it's actually right square in the like agile process, agile stuff that I talk about the most, which is systems thinking, right? It's recognizing, instead of going, husband, how would you have ever thought that was a good idea? You need to do better next time, and you've just got to figure it out. The question becomes, how do I set up the system, right? How do I set up this environment for everyone involved to be successful, right? And so that simple solution says, let's pull the value of whether or not this person knows how to separate laundry away. And instead, now we get to shift that over to, how do I present the situation so it's easy, right? So it just happens naturally. And that starts from this idea that I like to really hit, which is we're all doing the very, very best we can with the information we have. So we just need better information. Sorry.
Well, but even a step further back than that, because I tend to be very process oriented, and on top of being the historian I am, I also am an event planner, and I've been doing like large 4,000 person events for 20 years now. So I tend to look at everything as process. Less so, did you even know how to do it right? But does it actually matter to you, right? Because the value system at the core of something is this is actually, I think, one of the large frameworks of bias itself, right? Because you are actually ignoring. So instead of saying, did you know how to do it right, does how I see it done right even matter to you? Because some people are result oriented, right? And some people are process oriented, right? So it's like, well, did the clothes get clean? Right? Like, why are you worried about how? Right? So I think one of the things that in any sort of organization, whether it's a family or it's a business or it's, whatever, somewhere in between, right? You have to look at the value system that people are bringing to the table in the first place, right? So what are the things that are actually important to you, right? And for some people, whether you agree that it's right or wrong or it's good or bad, that's kind of a secondary and tertiary level here, right? The real question is, are you bringing the same value systems to the table? And if you're not, then everything else that you're negotiating and discussing after that becomes a moot point, right? Because if we're not, if we're not starting in the same, galaxy, let alone playing field, let alone starting line, right? Then how do we ever come to an accord? And I think this is why, we want to really look at that framework. And so I think if you're going to start any kind of training or any kind of thing, you've got to sort of establish some of these value-based baselines, right? Are we even entering this conversation from the same place, right? And that's, I think, a key part of it. And so for the laundry example again, right, maybe the other person just doesn't even think that like you need to separate something, right? Or you need to do something because they're just like, all right, well, it got clean, like, isn't this our end goal? Or even like someone cooking something. I remember I was on a week of bed rest very early in the pregnancy, and I had to just sort of like yell directions to my husband from the kitchen. And after like one night of doing that, we said, okay, takeout. This is not going to work. We're not approaching this the same way. The things that we even want to start with don't necessarily align. And I think that's a huge piece of it that people tend to sort of skip over and then have all of this, chasm of communication because they haven't even started in the same place, right?
That's yes. I don't even know what else to say to that. Like, you are preaching. Like, I swear you stole my soapbox and like made it so much better. But yeah, all of that, shifting to the process, aligning on values, right? This is something that good team kickoffs will often do as well, is just say, hey, none of us are going to want to do the same things the same way. So what are the values we have? And then how do we actually build expectations around those? And to bring that all the way back down or back around to your, what is it, ATU, all the unexpected? Yeah. All the unexpected is that sometimes we do just show up to our relationships, show up to our families with all of these preconceived notions on how things work, right? And how I'm supposed to show up in a particular space. But then things like preemie kids or the pandemic, or a huge rise in bigotry, all of these things change the way that we interact with each other, and change our values and impact us, and we bring them to work. So aligning on those values, I think, is super cool, and doing that with families and recognizing that families all have different values, not just the two parents, but the kids themselves, right? They've experienced the world differently enough that they have their own value system.
Yeah, I think that's, and part of it is the name of All the Unexpected itself is actually a play on the What to Expect site and books, right? Because it's also prescripted, right? So, and I did the same thing. I started off and I had the app, and every Tuesday I'd be like, "Ooh, we're a cantaloupe now," or "We're a whatever," and you're whatever fruit. I found one that was like French pastries instead, so it was kind of fun. So it was like, "You're the size of like a cornichon this weekend," like whatever, And so it was, very fun. But nonetheless, like, there was this prescribed thing of what you were supposed to be experiencing, what was supposed to be happening, and then none of that happens, and you're like, okay, what did I do wrong? And there's an internalization of something that you've done wrong, as opposed to embracing it and saying, guess what? It doesn't go as planned for a lot of us. And that was part of why we started the whole thing, because we wanted people to not feel so alone. And I've gotten, I had an email from a woman in Nigeria, and she said to me, "I'm listening to your story, and that's my story." And, it was just so impactful that on the other side of the world, in like a totally different cultural, historical, language milieu, right? Here was someone who was relating to what was happening because there was such humanity in the sense of not feeling like your plan happened or your thing happened. And I think that's such an important thing to kind of, make sure that everyone knows that, it's you don't have to necessarily follow the script, and you don't necessarily have to feel right sort of guilt or blame or any of the other things that come into play for things going differently than
Mhm.
the world imagined and even you yourself imagined, right?
I want to. Sorry, Darren, I'm taking up all of the
You're-
air. I'll let you
It's totally fine.
here in a second. In fact, well, yeah. I want to say that script, right? If you can't follow the script, and I think something that's really really important to remember is I don't think anyone can, right? I don't think that script is actually written for humans, right? It's written with all these expectations on what to do every day in every situation, like we all actually interact with the world the same. So it's not even a very good script in the first place, but that doesn't mean it doesn't impact us, right? It doesn't still follow us and say, oh, I should have done this with my tiny person, but I didn't. But if they're happy and they're healthy, right? One of the first choices we made was with our newest was you get a tablet time. I'll make sure that it's very clear what kind of games or things show up on there, and they're all going to be educational. But this kid, he's so much kinder than I could have made him because of all the shows he found on YouTube Kids, right? Between Blippi and some other things, but the script said don't let him. The script says don't do this, right? But now he's walking around being more polite than I am, which is actually really hard. So really props to that guy. So yeah, I really like, or I like the script comment because it's not for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Darren, we have some really fun comments. Would you mind reading
Sure.
Brett's and Carissa's and Sydney's comments?
Let's see. Deciding to use 2 blankets likely saved my marriage, from Brett. Yeah, same.
I can't recommend 2 bathrooms more than I have ever recommended anything in life. Like, if you have the luxury and the space and like game changing. Just everyone is. I'm like happy to share mine with a toddler, Put it that way.
I love that.
And Carissa says, this is why I don't make my bed or sort my socks. Lol. Doesn't have value. Sorry, not sorry to my parents. And Sydney Levitt, none of the laundry in our house got folded until my husband and I discovered that he hates folding and I hate putting it away. So now we separate it out and our laundry is always done. We're both very result-oriented people.
Thank you for those comments. And I think what's really cool about all those is they are simple changes in the approach, right? Not the value of someone. It's that, hey, let's find out how to make this work well. And from, is this actually valuable? Carissa recognizing sorting socks is not valuable to her. That was the same problem I had with my partner, who I think might be in the comments here, is I would just throw all my socks. I don't like wearing 2 of the same socks. And so, but that would drive her crazy when she was like trying to go through and match all my socks. And finally she's like, I can't do it. And I was like, well, I don't know why you do. Oh, okay. Well, I guess it kind of bothers me that I don't get to, because that's always really a fun part.
Well, maybe even just, I think the step back from all this is just having the conversation, right? Because I think one of the greatest, flaws in any relationship is assumption, right? So it's like you're sat there assuming, well, they just don't care, and the other person's sitting there assuming like, why do they care so much, right? And at the end of the day, if you just sit down and you have this conversation, right, you tend to kind of find, and it has to be done without emotion. We found, like, I think I was in the thrift store, maybe I found this great, like, yeah, I was in the thrift store and I found this great book that's just like a 60-second marriage devotional advice every day. And it's just different topics and you're meant to read it every day. And we do more like February 1st, March 3rd, like we don't really, like we definitely don't get to it every day. But one of the constant themes of it is, first of all, remove the emotion, right? So remove the fact that you're angry at the person, right? Remove the fact that you're sort of upset about the mixed laundry or the lack of socks or whatever, the issue is, and have a conversation from the I instead of the you. This is like a huge thing even with children, right? And so, I taught preschool for a long time, and if your whole conversation and your whole sort of approach to everything involves always the you, well, you upset me because you did this, right? Or you made the bad choice, or you did something, right? Then there's a constant state of defensiveness. Like, we'd all be defensive if everyone was accusing us of stuff all of the time, right? And so even, in a workplace situation, this is all very relevant. And so if you start it from the I, right? I happen to be a control freak who likes the bed made, right? And this is what makes me happy to go to sleep on crispy sheets. I like doing that, right? And chances are, instead of being resentful that I said, well, you never make the bed, right? The person who loves you and is in a healthy relationship with you is like, you know what? This little thing might make my partner happy. And I'm willing to go out of my own comfort zone to do that thing for them to make them happy, right? And it takes on a whole different dynamic when you present it from why it is the I statement of my opinion or my assumption or what it is, and there's a clarity to it. And I think that's such an important piece of it is to stop assuming, right? To stop, the game of blame and say, this is how I feel. And the other person might be like, wow, I never even knew that. I can't believe you feel that way. That's definitely not true, right? And there you go. All of this gray area and all of these assumptions and resentment tends to grow. It's like black mold, right? Um, become sort of transparent. And once again, like with the sunlight and light of day, right, it can't grow, right? And it doesn't fester. And I think that's a huge piece of this.
Have you read Radical Candor by Kim Scott?
Mm-hmm.
Huge fan. But Kim Scott has this, she uses this square of how much you care about a person. So that's your x-axis. And then y is actually challenging them, right? Actually telling them these things. And that's a huge deal that I seem to find here. People are really good at figuring out exactly what you've done wrong in my particular culture, my local community, but they don't tell you, right? So if you don't so radical candor is a combination of challenging directly and caring personally. So that understanding that people are going to have different values and feel differently, but that second, we get to, the more we give that feedback, not less, the more we say, that hurt. I recognize that may not have been really a reasonable thing for me to be heard about, but I did have these feelings, gives us that opportunity to really talk to each other.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'd say if you want to live in a place where people don't tell you anything, try living in Japan. Like, as I spent 5 years going to meetings where no one's gonna ever tell you the word no because it's impolite. But if they tell you, it might be a better idea if you start to learn that's a hard no. And so, but I think that's also another piece of it too, though, right? You have to find a balance of negotiating spaces as well, right? Because I think we can go so far in one direction that we tend to disregard that places or spaces or companies do have an established culture, whether you agree with it or not, right? It's and maybe I've spent a long time reading a lot of Taoist literature, right? And the idea of, sort of bending with things in order to make change, as opposed to sort of always having to fight up against, the rock wall, right? And so the idea that if you're asking for someone else or a place or a space to show you the flexibility and the malleability and the adaptability, right? That has to sort of be something that you bring to the table as well. obviously not to the extreme of completely ignoring your own wishes or your own, your sort of self, but there has to be a give and take in any relationship. And I think that's such an important part of it, right? And so that, if you're joining a family or joining an organization, or you're coming into a classroom, right? All of those sort of things, understanding that you have a role in it as well, right? And that's this sort of back and forth, and it becomes less of a force of wills and rather an exchange of energies, right?
Ooh, I love that. Right. Exchange of energies versus a force of will. Sorry, Darren, did you have? I just jumped right in again.
It's all right. You go ahead and finish your thought.
It's a long one, so why don't you go?
Well, I'm going to be changing the subject, so you finish your thought.
Well, I that idea, that exchanging of energies, that shifting of that. This is right from systems thinking. Is this that classroom, right? It's no longer you and a bunch of other people. That classroom is all learning together, right? They influence each other and they change the way that education actually happens. So if you allow everyone to show up and have the same amount of space with all of the baggage that comes with them, and if some of that baggage is too heavy, let's look at why, right? Because chances are that person didn't want all that baggage. They're showing up with the cultural systems that we have right now. And going to a class right now would be impossible for me because I am so overwhelmed with the amount of anti-trans legislation hitting us right now that being able to sit down and actually absorb something in a deep way is really, really difficult without panic setting in. But when we shift that from my will versus your will to we're both two people creating the same system, now it's just, okay, you get to have a little bit of the energy, I'm going to use this energy, and we actually build better things together. Anyway, so, okay, yep, Darren, why don't you go?
Well, I want to know more about Kimberly's work. So I want to know where can I find your story? Where can I watch your documentaries? Where are these things located?
Sure. So our name is our website. So you just go to alltheunexpected, it's one word.com. And it is a web destination that has the page for the podcasts, the documentaries have a page, the different articles. So we've got sort of two different sections of the articles. One is more just the sort of very journalistic approach to it. And then I started something called the Founder's Journal as well, which is just sort of my thoughts and musings and kind of takes on things. And so I was talking a little bit about historiography and subjectivity and the kind of different things that we have. And there are links to the documentaries. We're also on all of the socials you can possibly think of. And if you just search all the unexpected, then that kind of comes up as well.
And if I'm understanding right, there's one of the documentaries you wanted to show us.
Yeah, so I think we are going to watch. So this documentary is actually looking at the history of Black motherhood in the United States and how it was kind of marked by separation from the days of slavery. So when Black women served as wet nurses, to their master's children as opposed to being able to take care of their own children, and how that has translated and kind of reverberated to the present. So I'll say no more, I guess, if you can see it.
Okay.
That sounds.
Marriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. Ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I've plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could heed me. Ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. Ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen most of all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. Ain't I a woman? Sojourner Truth, 1851, Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio. The history of Black motherhood in the United States has been marked by separation. From the time of slavery, the American Black woman has been viewed through the lens of the labor she can provide others. Her role as wife and mother minimalized by the expectations of her work outside the home. The legacy of these ideas formed during the infancy of this nation is still felt, even today, as Black women experience motherhood differently than their white counterparts, even in the first few hours after giving birth. Subjected to tropes such as the mammy, who in almost comical irony is characterized as the ultimate caretaker for white children, while simultaneously being neglectful to her own. Black women have for centuries seen their motherhood and their mothering called into question. The modern incarnation of the quote-unquote welfare queen is the Black mother as a dishonest materialist who only has children in order to game the system for more money. The lasting impact of such inaccuracies has been devastating. During slavery, Black women were called upon to be wet nurses to the children of their white owners, often separated from their own children, sometimes permanently, just after giving birth. This practice continued even with emancipation, as many families, especially in the South, continued to employ Black women in domestic capacities. In the first decades of the 20th century, as economic opportunity began to expand for Black men, many Black women were for the first time in a position to make the choice to stay home and care for their own children. The dwindling supply of domestic labor didn't sit well with many employers, and laws were passed in many places requiring Black women to work, even if they had other means of support. A 1918 article from Greensboro, South Carolina, is a prime example of one such ordinance. It read in entirety: Negro women to be put to work. Regardless of whether they want to or have to, able-bodied Negro women in Greenville who are not regularly employed are to be put to work, put in jail, or fined heavily. At its special meeting yesterday afternoon, City Council discussed the situation with regard to this class of loafers at some length, and it seemed that all members of the council were agreed that steps should be taken to compel them to engage in some useful occupation. It was decided that an ordinance similar to the one now in force requiring all able-bodied men to work at least 5 days a week should be passed with regard to these women. Such an ordinance will be prepared and voted on at the next regular meeting of the council. A number of complaints have come to members of the council of Negro women who are not at work and who refuse employment when it's offered to them. The result being that it is exceedingly difficult for families who need cooks and laundresses to get them. Wives of colored soldiers getting a monthly allowance from the government have a number of them declined to work on the ground that they can get along without working, according to reports. Others have flatly refused jobs without giving any reason whatever, while still others pretend that they are employed, when, as a matter of fact, they derive a living from illegitimate means. The proposed ordinance will require them all to carry a labor identification card, showing that they are regularly and usefully employed, and the labor inspectors and police will be charged with the duty of rigidly enforcing the law. To make this abundantly clear, in the 20th century, there were Black women whose husbands were gainfully employed, some even by the U.S. military, who were told that by law they could not stay home with their families because someone needed a maid. The same 20th century in which most adults alive today were born. This assault on Black motherhood would continue. The 1940s saw a rise in the more widespread use of baby formula, and companies were quick to market their product to Black families. The combination of negative historical associations with being wet nurses and the reality of many Black women having to return to work very soon after giving birth made Black women prime targets for these advertising campaigns. By the 1950s, organizations such as La Leche League were formed. Their messages and campaigns were largely designed to encourage white women to breastfeed, while once again marginalizing Black motherhood. Images of white women breastfeeding their children began to be normalized, while one would only find an image of a woman of color doing so in the pages of National Geographic or the like. The Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, also known as WIC, was launched in 1974. Women participating in these programs were more often than not encouraged to use formula, and to this day, Black women remain overrepresented in its participants. Historical wealth and wage gaps between races and genders leave Black women on average in the lowest. They are employed at a higher rate than any other group in the service industry, working jobs that often offer no maternity leave and almost certain accommodation for nursing mothers. A 2016 study found that Black mothers as likely to be given formula than white mothers during their postpartum hospital stays. Other studies highlighted implicit bias on the part of lactation consultants who reported spending less time with Black mothers based on the false belief that they would, quote, not breastfeed anyways. Centuries of structural racism, societal norms, and implicit bias have led to the grim reality that as a group, Black babies have the highest infant mortality rate in the United States, with preterm birth also being a determining factor in the disparity of these rates. The survival of preterm infants is exponentially increased when they are given human milk and also time and contact with their parents. Yet, even today, having the opportunity to offer this care to their own children is still not possible for many Black mothers. It's high time we examine the root causes of such disparities and do the collective work of learning mistakes of the past in order to shape a better future for Black mothers and their children.
I guess I'll just say, wow, it's so hard to hear, these parts of history that impact our days, like our lives today. Like it's, even if we're not doing the same exact things as we did, way back then, there's still like remnants of these horrible practices today and like stereotypes. And that was very sad to watch.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I still, when people generally, I run all the expected, but otherwise I'm a stay-at-home mom, and it's very often people say to me, oh, well, what do you do? I'm home with my daughter. Oh, really? And there's still a sort of taken abackness that is what I do, and I understand it's a luxury. I understand it's an option that many people don't have, right? But there's still an ingrained notion. I had a woman tell me, with all, I guess, sort of sincerity in her heart, oh, well, we live in Western Montana. Oh, well, they're looking for healthcare workers and nurses here. Like, you really should just look into it. And I'm saying, first of all, I'm a teacher by training. Like, second of all, this is me once again with the child home, not actively looking for work, not sort of, and so just to this day that we still have ingrained notions, right? And there's a lot of the history that comes into play. And so especially and this all started actually because I saw a post that somebody had made about that law. And I was like, that can't be true. And me being me starts digging into, city ordinances in 1920s Greensboro, finds the original microfiche, like goes in and starts doing this research. And that was the kind of genesis of the project, that yes, these laws were in fact real, that there was compulsory labor, and that slavery, most certainly in terms of compulsory labor, didn't end in 1865, right? And so really just looking at all of these issues, and they lead up into today, right? And so that you've even got a situation where one of the studies we published at the end of highlighted at the end of the movie was that lactation consultants, by often and not, will say, oh, well, we're not going to try as hard because these people don't breastfeed, right? And just looking at just how much history has played into the bias, and that you have to, instead of sort of wringing your hands about the current state of affairs, ask yourself, how did we get there?
Mm-hmm.
I feel for you there, because I also had, I raised my kids by myself from when my youngest was 1 on. I had to rely on WIC. It's interesting to know that a Black woman gets treated the same as I did at WIC. Here, you have to have formula because you can't breastfeed. The fact that they do that to Black women too, it makes sense for me. It doesn't make sense for Black women. It's insane that there's like that level of just like imbalance there.
Yeah, and just there's so many different assumptions that play, and then so it's like you're looking at a perfect storm, right? So if you're looking at a situation where Black women are overrepresented in terms of preterm labor for a series of reasons, we can talk about societal stresses, we can talk about all of the different things that go into play, and they just did a study recently, and they said in terms of Black maternal mortality, there is no correction for socioeconomic status. So when we make this a situation of saying, oh well, okay, poor mothers don't have prenatal care, it's like, no, you're talking about whether you are a 16-year-old mother on Medicaid, or you are a 35-year-old woman like me with an advanced degree. You are still as likely to experience these things as your counterpart with no education and sort of all of the other factors that would normally play into poor prenatal care, right? And so when we really look at it being that widespread and that systemic, it's not about these other factors, right? And so that's a huge piece of it, and we really have to break it down. We really have to say what is going on along the ways, and so that once again, if you've got this disproportionate number of preterm babies, right, who we know, it is not opinion, it is scientific fact that they benefit more from human milk, because your entire gut biome is going to be shaped during that part of your life where you were still meant to be in utero and you no longer are not, right? That if you've got even less access to it, then your other health outcomes are more determinable too. So it's so many different things. You can't just sort of
Hold on, I think
red flags.
Oh, we've come back.
Okay, your sound got a little muffled for a second there.
Sorry.
No, you're
good now.
Can you just repeat the last thing you said, if you can remember?
Yeah, no, I said, the idea that instead of continuing to ignore these sort of blazing red flags and what's actually going on, right, we have to look at systemically, how did we get here step by step? And that's the piece of why we did this documentary, why we did the first one, and why we're actually hard at work on a third one, which I can give you a little teaser about, which looks at how Black midwifery and the use of midwives was eradicated in the 20th century, and what that's meant for maternal health. And it's all correlated. It was all very intentional. None of this was accidental. And we really have to talk about what that looks like when you're talking about sort of a systemic series of events and not just these happenstance, right?
Yeah, it's all connected. It's cause and effect is what it is. Like the way the things have happened result from the way things are. Go ahead, Dee.
One of the things I read last year, where I did the exact same thing, like that can't be true, is that most medical books do not have Black bodies in them. And so there was, so last year, the article I was reading was someone that went through their own textbook and ended up spending the time and energy to create and show images of Black people with the particular disease.
He's a student in Nigeria. I actually follow him on LinkedIn. The name I could look it up really quick to get you. I don't remember his exact name, but he recently released the whole book. Yeah, he's a medical student in Nigeria. He's since won a series of awards, and actually there were quite a few things that were going on simultaneously on the African continent. So there was him who showed that first image of a Black fetus, and everybody was kind of like, whoa, and it's like this whole and when you think about sort of visual images are so stark because you're so conditioned to see visual images in one way, and when you see sort of a disparate image, right, it has a shock value because it is so different. Another interesting thing was that another student, I believe also either in Nigeria or Kenya, I don't want to misspeak, but he was talking about how the actual diagnosis tools for different skin conditions didn't take skin color into account. So a lot of them were very flawed. And he actually went about rewriting some of the protocol, right? And so, yeah, it was a very, sorry, it was a very...
No worries.
Great.
It was a very sort of enlightening moment for a lot of people to think about what, even the textbooks. By the way, the nursing textbooks, and it just got taken out in, I think, the 2022 edition, said for a long time that people experience pain differently. And there was still in the nursing textbook that the fact that they said, Black patients will experience pain at different levels. And these things that come straight out of New England Journal of Medicine circa 1830 that we're still propagating. The first documentary, we actually talk about that and look at the studies and how some of the sort of foundations of and we have to really take that into account. The foundations of Western medicine come out of a very particular set of people in a very particular time in 19th century America in the 1830s, and a lot of the procedures, and especially obstetrical procedures that we have these days, come directly from experimentation that was done on slave women without anesthetic, without consent, and so looking at really what that means to have that legacy, and then you sort of in a body of the descendant of one of those people enter into these institutions, right, with all of that historical weight on your shoulders. What does that really mean? And we really have to acknowledge what that is, right, and what that feeling is, and that's real.
Thank you. Like, there's this part of me that recognizes every time we go, that's crazy that this happened, that it's another bit of, that's another thing that has been added to the experience of, Black women or any traditionally excluded group. But it still is so, when put together like that, between the textbooks that don't say anything about Black people to, and then say it has nothing to do with the infant mortality rate for Black women, when we can see there's a ton of places within the system to make improvements that we just haven't wanted to.
Well, I think even taking it a step further to acknowledge the privilege that it is to be shocked, right? Because a lot of people will watch that film and say, "Wow, I'm shocked," and people who look like me are like, "Well, it's Tuesday." And so it's there's just even and I think that's one of the things that I really often talk to people about when they talk about, because I think privilege is such a loaded topic these days, and people have such a visceral reaction to say, well, I'm not experiencing privilege, and to not have to experience, to not have to think about something, to not have to take something into consideration is in itself a privilege. It is. And we have to sort of acknowledge that on a very base level, right? I tell a story of my kid being 2 at the time, it was like 6 months ago, jumps off the couch, rolls her ankle, right? Like you spend the first 5 years of like just keeping them alive because they're just like hell bent on doing the opposite, right?
Yep.
And so, here I go, and I'm saying, all right, we gotta go. We call the pediatrician. She goes, just go to the ER, get it checked out, right? So here we are, going to the ER, and my first thought, looking like me, being in this country, is let me find one of my ironed button downs. Let me make sure that we're dressed. Let me make sure that we're doing all this, because you know what situation you're going to. I'm not going to give someone an excuse to call CPS. I'm not going to give someone a reason to question my motherhood, to question my things. But I have to think about that. And how many people could have just said, messy hair. All right, I run to the hospital because I'm frantic and I'm crazy, and you would be out of sorts, and no one would look twice at you, right?
Mm-hmm.
We had the same experience in the NICU. Like, even when it was emotional, even when it was something, you had to be calm, cool, and collected. And that's another step. And in itself of not having to think. They released a study recently, and there was in California, it was a California Department of Health, and they asked a bunch of people, what do you do to prepare to go to the doctor? And, it was a bunch of Black people, and different things like, I will make sure I dress a certain way. I'll make sure I say certain things. I'll make sure and all of this extra thing so that you are even taken seriously in that situation, and not having to operate in the world that way, not having to think about, oh, what does my hair look like? What does my shirt look like? What do? I look professional? Do I look this? Do I look that? Right? That in itself is a privilege. And we have to sort of acknowledge that people are coming to the table with very different life experiences, and what that even means. And that's a huge part of both ends of it, right? And so the idea of just the shock value versus the people saying, well, this is life, right? That privilege of even being surprised by something, right? So it's just, I think that's a very important thing to sort of keep in the back of your mind when you navigate any of these issues, right?
Yeah, it's a thing that we take for granted. Being white folk, we don't notice the privilege that we have, that that we don't have to overthink how we present ourselves in public places, or because it really doesn't matter. People don't really care that much about how we present ourselves, because they're just like, but I mean, but recognizing that other people have to put effort into that, I mean, it's so exhausting, and it's terrible that this is a system that we've got in our world, but in trying to dismantle it is not an easy task.
No, but having the discussions is the first step, right? Like talking about raising the awareness, right, in the first place, of saying, look, let's think about what everyone's coming to the table with, right? So there was even like a discussion, people were talking about the whole return to office thing and all of the different things, and you had a lot of Black women saying, great, here's another $400 I got to spend every month on doing my hair again, because now I'm going to have to be presentable to a certain extent each and every day when I got a break from that, right? So just the little sort of taxes of life, and acknowledging that at a certain point all of that does add up, and you hear a lot of this promotion of rest these days, because people are just like, they're tired. They're like, I just, like, everything shouldn't be so hard, right? And there has to be a sort of understanding that, even the everyday, as difficult for it is, because everyone is struggling in some way or another, right? As privileged and advantaged and whatever as each person might look, I always say, you have no idea what goes on behind closed doors, right? You have no idea what each person is just dealing with on a daily basis, right? But that being aside, right, let's start to sort of internalize the kind of added tax, right? And so that it's even just from the intersection of gender and race and all of these different things, and like how much more expensive it is, right, to like to be one thing versus another, right? And so all of those things being in play, and I think that's such an important part. And it's about raising awareness, it's about having discussions. It's also about having discussions without blame, right? Like, no one's saying it's the next person's fault. No one's saying, it's whatever, but we're saying, if we as a collective, as society, are deciding to make meaningful change, right, then how do we do that? And we have to sort of acknowledge the varied collective experience that each person has gone through just to sit down in this space this morning, right? So yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Darren.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like I appreciate being able to have these sort of conversations. You know, I'm this white male. You know, it's like I I am the one who benefits from all the structure of, you know, I'm the one who benefits from white supremacy. Let's be honest. Like I also see it as, you know, I can take it upon myself to help dismantle it by talking about it and being open about how destructive it is to other people. And
Yeah. But also not at the same time discounting yourself, right? Because I think that's the problem too. So many people rail against these kind of efforts because they're saying, hey, I'm having trouble too. And I'm saying, you know, where I live in my rural Pacific Northwest county, and my neighbors are cowboys, and we're all sitting there in the store, you know, looking very different from me, and everyone's just kind of like shaking their head at the meat prices, being like, "Really, guys?" You know, and we're in this boat together. And I think that's been one of the biggest things that they've divided and conquered in this country, is to make everybody, you know, kind of not realize that, guess what, like those on high, those perpetuating this whole system have been benefiting from all of us in the milieu actually feeling so different, thinking that we're so different, when at the end of the day, you know, and I've lived on 4 continents and I've seen, you know, family life and people's lives, and the concerns are the same. Raising happy, healthy children, providing for your family, doing what you need to do, right? And so that if we sort of find that humanity, and it really is humanity that links us, we're all in the struggle together. We're all, you know, doing our best each and every day and kind of trying to navigate it. And so instead of saying, you know, it's my burden to do this, or it's your burden to do this, or whatever, saying, you know what, guess what? We all are different players in a system that frankly is not designed for any of us to be on top, right? Like let's be real. And that's, I think, the most human way to have that discussion.
Which I love, that we're all in this together. It just feels nice.
For sure, yeah.
Because it gets painted often that it's us versus them, but it's not. It's, you know, we're all together. Well, I guess we better wrap up, huh? So let's pop up a QR code for how you can donate money to Kimberly and to All the Unexpected.
Thank you. So we are in the process of fundraising to actually expand the website to include 4 core languages. So it's going to be Spanish, French, Portuguese, and English as base to kind of cover most of the global south, so that all of the future things, we're going to plan a lot of informational things, how to choose a provider, how to make sure your care looks like it does for you, and all of these sort of helpful things for families. And I want them to be available in various languages. And so it's really just kind of ramping up that campaign to make the site itself just as accessible as possible.
Well, awesome.
Okay, well, donate money to Kimberly. Give her as much money as you can. And we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and tell us about all you're doing and sharing with us your documentary. And everybody should go watch all the rest of them too. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you all, and I look forward, if you guys just email the contact form on the website, it comes directly to me. I read everything, I see all your emails, so I would love to hear from anyone, and we're always looking for new ideas and for help.
It's good practice. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you so much.